Johnny Liberty. Thank you, John.
I hail out of Oregon, and I'm an Oregon state citizen, a sovereign citizen of the Oregon Republic. Thank you. And I began this work not that long ago, about 3 years ago, and I had attended a workshop of a man who was talking about money and how money systems work. He actually was a black man who had studied the Emancipation Proclamation, who was also an Oregon state citizen, and he began to open my eyes to some of the historical facts that had been neglected and ignored in American history. And it piqued my eyebrows and my interest, and I said, oh, that's very interesting. I want to find out more for myself. And so over the course of the last 3 years, I have participated in in-depth research and study and education, and have synthesized many of the independent researchers that have been involved in this patriot movement for 30 or 40 years. And that's the source of my inspiration and the source of my inspiration and information as well. So I want to acknowledge everyone who has come before me and those who have blazed the trail, many of them who may be sitting in this room right now, who may have been involved in this work much longer than I have. So thank you very much, everybody, for your contribution. Now, tonight, the title of this talk is Reclaiming Your Sovereign Citizenship, and I use that as a broad subject to talk about all kinds of things, including sovereignty, citizenship, American history, and how political, economic, and legal systems actually work. Now, as Ralph had mentioned in the introduction, my background is as a whole systems educator. So what I'm able to do is take very complicated material and articulate it in such a fashion that people can actually understand what is going on. Because most people, unfortunately, not necessarily the people in this room, most people don't have a clue what is happening in this country. That they get most of their information from the media, or they get it from the newspaper or the television, or they learned about such and such in their history books or in their higher education, but unfortunately didn't really get the whole picture. So tonight, I would like to provide an overview of the research and the education that I've discovered over the last 3 years, and present it comprehensively for all of you so that I can inspire you and empower you to take the next step in this whole movement of reclaiming our sovereignty, restoring our citizenship, restoring the republic, and correcting a lot of the problems that we have today in America. So we're going to cover a lot of material tonight. We're going to look at sovereignty and what that is, because what I have discovered is that sovereignty is the key concept around which all political, economic, and legal systems revolve. And we must get a deepening understanding of what sovereignty is in order to embrace the possibilities of rediscovering America, in fact. We're also going to look at citizenship and the distinctions thereof. Now, I'm sure we've had many other speakers here that have addressed these issues, Richard McDonald and the state citizen people. But for those of you who are new, please bear with us. For those who already know, we're going to review these things and the distinctions of citizenship that exist in this country, and how it was 220 years ago, and how the sovereign citizenship has been encroached over that 220-year period, and what historical events happened through the course of our history, where today, in 1995, we wake up and our sovereignty and our citizenship is a memory, a distant memory in most people's minds, except for those who have recently reclaimed it and are once again drawing that line in the sand and placing a limitation upon the government. We're also going to look at political systems and how they actually work, what really goes on in Washington, D.C., who really is directing and controlling the United States government, because it isn't the people that you've elected and it isn't the president, but it's the creditors of the United States that actually direct it. And we're going to look and see how it is that the political system is related to the economic system, and from the Federal Reserve Act on up to the present time, and the bankruptcies that we've experienced, and how bankruptcy affects the political system and the legal system. And then we're going to look at the legal system too, and actually how the legal systems operate, what jurisdictions they're operating under, and how we can develop effective strategies to use the courts, to use the administrative processes that we have available to reclaim our rights and defend those rights once we've reclaimed them. So, we're going to begin with sovereignty itself. Sovereignty is the source of authority from which all laws and governments arise. So if you are a sovereign power, and traditionally in the West and in Europe there were two sources of sovereignty. There were the monarchs, which were the kings and the queens, and there was the Pope and the Catholic Church. And both of those were sources of sovereignty. If you were the sovereign, then your word was the law. It was the same as law. So if you decreed something, it was the same as law. And up until modern times, people, the common people, had no remedy or recourse in relationship to the sovereign. It wasn't until the Magna Carta of 1215 and the Petition of Rights of 1618 in England, and they were the first times that the common people actually had recourse and remedy against the decree of the sovereign. So if you were the sovereign, you created the law. And then out of you, out of the sovereign power, you created nation states, and you created governments, you created corporations, you created banks. All of those were created out of the sovereignty itself to serve the sovereignty. And the sovereign powers set up their commercial affairs and their business affairs in trust structures. So the monarch, the king, and the queen of England, for example, set up a sovereign trust out of which the British Empire came. And all the assets and the banks and the nations and parliament were all subject to that trust. And the same is true of many of the other sovereign powers as well. The Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican as the government was created out of the sovereignty of the Pope and the Catholic Church. Now, what's unique here in the United States of America is when this country was settled and founded, many of the people that came over here were settling here to escape from either religious persecution or for political persecution from one of the sovereign powers or one of the governments that were in Europe. And so the people that settled this country did not have high regard for the systems of government or for the traditional sources of sovereignty. And so they were very hesitant to set up a form of government here in the United States of America where they'd have a king, or they would set up a religious leader as the head of state. And so instead of doing that, when they set up this government, they created the sovereign to be the citizen instead of another king. And so built into the American system of law, which begins with the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the American Revolution, which was fought to defend that declaration, and the Treaty of Peace with Great Britain, which was at the conclusion of the American Revolution. That's the foundation of the American system of law, whereby sovereignty is vested in both the citizen and the states. So in order to understand the Constitution, for example, you must understand those instruments first, because the Constitution makes no sense unless you take into consideration that the Constitution was derived from the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Treaty of Peace. And so they have to be seen together. But that's where the principles of sovereignty and the principles that were laid out in the Constitution, which set up the United States government and the U.S. corporation, it was created by the Constitution, but from the sovereignty of we the people. We the people are the sovereigns in the constitutional republic by law. And we have 220 years of the American system of law. We have a track record that has never been replicated in any other country anywhere else in the world. The United States of America is unique in the world. This is an experiment that was 220 years old. Remember, prior to that, there had never been a time when the common people anywhere were sovereign to anybody. They were all subjects, slaves, serfs, indentured, etc., etc. So our experiment in freedom and liberty for the people began here 220 years ago with the creation of the United States of America. And that's what makes it very difficult for the New World Order to come in here and just simply brush us aside and brush aside our freedoms, because we have it built into our heart and soul And we are not willing to just brush it aside and become willing slaves again. And that is why they are so afraid of the people. Our government is terrified of us, that we would take responsibility for our lives, that we would actually want to live as free people. And that is part of the polarization that exists here in the country today. And we're going to talk a lot more about how all that works and what we can do about it as well, because we are not helpless in all of this.